Hey everyone, it's Dr. A, and in today's video, we'll be taking a look at neurons and glial cells. And as we consider these terms, here's a quick overview. Neurons are the cells, or we can consider them to be the primary workers of the nervous system. And glial cells are the support cells to neurons. In other words, our glial cells help neurons to function appropriately. So let's start by taking a look at the types of neurons that exist. First, we have multipolar neurons, followed by bipolar neurons, and then we have unipolar neurons. So without further ado, let's jump into a description for multipolar neurons. And as we do this, let's take a look at the image that we have here on the left side of the screen. Looking at the image alone, we can see that we have a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. But let's make a descriptor for this neuron type so that it's easier for us to differentiate it from the other neurons we'll talk about in just a few moments. So for the structure of a multipolar neuron, we can say that we have one axon with multiple dendrites that extend from one cell body. And if we think about it, it makes sense that we would call this multipolar because we have multiple dendrite projections, hence the name itself. Now, having this description is helpful, but what about its function? Well, let's just make note of the fact that multipolar neurons are the most common type of neurons that we'll come across. And when we see them, they behave either as motor neurons or as interneurons. So let's differentiate between these for just a moment. A motor neuron indicates that this type of neuron is going to play a role in producing some type of movement for the body. And when we use the term interneuron, I like to think of these as relay neurons. In other words, their responsibility is to take and transfer nerve signal messages. So in essence, what happens is that an interneuron picks up a message from a sensory neuron and delivers it to a motor neuron. Now, in terms of location, we'll find multipolar neurons in the brain, spinal cord, and in autonomic tissue. Now, when we use the word autonomic, we're referring to body tissues or organs that have involuntary movement. In other words, we don't have any conscious control over it. So examples here would be the heart, the lungs, and through the process of digestion. And again, this makes sense if we think about it, because for these organs and processes, as we mentioned a moment ago, there's some type of movement taking place. And last but not least, we'll find multipolar neurons connected to our skeletal muscles. Next, we have bipolar neurons. And again, looking at the image on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see that our bipolar neurons have one axon, one cell body, and one dendrite. So now that we've reviewed the image, let's put our description with it. So again, real quick, we have our one axon, our one cell body, and our one dendrite, which has its own smaller dendrite branches. And what we can make note of here is that the dendrite and axon are on opposite sides of the cell body. So now that we've got our structure covered, let's talk about function. Our bipolar neurons are the least numerous of the neuron types, and they function primarily as sensory neurons. In other words, they're responsible for helping us to detect various senses, such as smell, vision, and hearing. And so because of these, we're likely to find bipolar neurons in the eye, specifically the retina, the nose, namely the olfactory epithelium, and the ear, specifically the cochlea. Now let's take a look at our last neuron type, which is the pseudo or unipolar neuron. So again, on the screen towards the left-hand side, we have what appears to be some dendrites. It also looks like we have one long axon and a cell body. Now, before we identify the descriptors on the right-hand side of the screen, let's take a moment to talk about the terminology here. Pseudo means false, and unipolar means one pole or one process. So in essence, a unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neuron is not really a one-process structure, and we'll see why in just a moment. So for structure, let's list that we have a cell body, And although it looks like one long continuous axon, in actuality we have a peripheral process and a central process. Now, for added context, the peripheral process functions like a traditional dendrite, and the central process is what functions like a traditional axon. So you see, it's not really one pole or one process, it's actually two that have been fused together. Now, in terms of function, these neurons always function as sensory receptors, meaning they're responsible for detecting various sensations, and we'll see this primarily in the skin. Alright, let's switch gears now, and as we switch gears, let's take a look at glial cells. Now, the term glial is analogous to the term glue. So when I think about the term glue being used, I think about it supporting something. And that's what glial cells do. They support neurons. Now, we can divide the types of glial cells associated with the nervous system into two categories. Those that are associated with the central nervous system and those that are associated with the peripheral nervous system. Now, those that are associated with the central nervous system include astrocytes, microglia, ependymal cells, and oligodendrocytes. So let's look at these individually. Starting with astrocytes, we get the name for these type of glial cells based on their shape or appearance. If we look at the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see that they do have a star-like appearance. And specifically, what we're looking at in this image are these finger-like projections being attached to a given capillary. And that will help give us an indication about its function in just a moment. So as we continue to describe these types of glial cells, we can first note that they have many processes extending from their cell body. Now, it's important to note here that these extensions aren't the same as what we find in the neuron, where we have axons or dendrites, and for that reason, they are just called cell extensions. And in terms of their functions, there are many, but the one key function we'll focus on here is their ability to connect neurons to nearby capillaries. And what they do is they take up glucose from the bloodstream, they convert it into lactate, and then they supply that lactate to neurons to help meet their energy demands. Next on our list is microglia, and based on the term alone, we can understand that micro means small, so we essentially have small glial cells. What's unique here is that these glial cells begin as white blood cells, specifically macrophages, and within their development, they become part of the central nervous system. And now that we have that background, it makes sense that because these glial cells started off as white blood cells, that they would provide some protective support or mechanism to the body. And that's exactly what they do. They function to ingest and digest pathogens that cause disease within the body. The next type of glial cell that we'll find within the central nervous system are ependymal cells. And if we take a look at the picture on the left side of the screen, we can see that these are cuboidal or cube-like cells that have hair-like projections called cilia. And these ependymal cells line the cavities of the brain, which are oftentimes referred to as ventricles. And in addition to lining the ventricles of the brain, they also line the canal of the spinal cord. And in terms of function, their responsibility is to filter blood to make cerebrospinal fluid. And the cerebrospinal fluid is vital in helping to nourish the brain and spinal cord with the vital nutrients they need to continue functioning appropriately. Now, last up on our list of glial cells that belong to the central nervous system are oligodendrocytes. And if we look at the image on the left-hand side of the screen, it may be difficult to get a true handle on what we're looking at. But essentially, oligodendrocytes, the round circular structure that we see labeled, wraps its processes around axons to form myelin sheets. And it's the formation of myelin sheets that lead to fast nerve signal conduction. Now, one note to make here is that not all oligodendrocytes produce myelin sheets. So when we come across those that don't produce myelin, we can simply note that their job is to provide structural and metabolic support to their assigned neurons. In other words, they help the neurons that they attach to do their job appropriately. Alright, let's switch gears and let's talk about the glial cells that are associated with the peripheral nervous system. And of these, we have Schwann cells and satellite cells. So let's begin by first looking at Schwann cells. Alright, this image that we have on the left-hand side of the screen showcases our Schwann cells. And similar to our image earlier of the Oligodendrocytes, it's hard to identify exactly what we're looking at by this picture alone. But what we have here on the picture furthest to the right, indicated by the letter F, showcases the nucleus of a Schwann cell that is wrapped around a given axon to form myelin sheaths, which again helps to increase signal conduction speed. And the picture furthest to the left, noted by the letter E, showcases a Schwann cell that is covering and protecting an unmyelinated nerve fiber. And again, similar to what we described with the oligodendrocytes, if a Schwann cell isn't producing a myelin sheath for a given axon, its role and responsibility is to provide structural and metabolic support. Now, just a small add-on here, we may be tempted to say that Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes are the same. But keep in mind, oligodendrocytes belong to the central nervous system, and Schwann cells belong to the peripheral nervous system. And they do have some distinct differences in functionality. But what we'll highlight here for just a moment is that Schwann cells have a greater chance of regeneration than do oligodendrocytes in the event of an injury. And last but not least, for our glial cells of the peripheral nervous system, we have satellite cells. And as we look at the picture to the left-hand side of the screen, we can get a sense that these satellite cells look round in appearance. But we can be a little bit more precise in our description. So let's jot down here that these satellite cells are small, flattened, dome-shaped, or satellite-shaped cells. And their responsibility is to surround the cell body of a neuron in the peripheral nervous system. And it's their presence that helps to provide structural and metabolic support to neurons in the peripheral nervous system. Well, thank you for watching this video. I hope it's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.